So thanks, Craig. As my fellow panelists assemble on the stage, I'd first like to thank ACG on behalf of the panel for having us. I always love these things, mostly because I get to listen to other smart people. I'm a little dense myself. But in fact, I thought the reason I was invited was I must be doing something right. I must be really smart or something. It turns out that I just learned that all the guys on the nominating committee for the panel are Kellogg alums. So it was a stacked deck. But I'm Rob Wolcott. I'm a professor of innovation management and strategy at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. So this issue of looking out into the future is quite important to me, to my clients, colleagues, students, etc. It turns out that we have to manage for the future looking through a rearview mirror. We've all heard that, but the older I get, the more I realize how incredibly poignant that fact is, because we can only really look back with a certain level of certainty. That's a philosophical discussion at the past. We certainly don't know what exactly is going to happen in the future. But we do have a requirement to try our best to figure it out. We have a requirement to try and find leading indicators of where the world might be trending. If you think about the way that business is managed, and I include government, nonprofits, by the way, nonprofits are just businesses with a different tax status. They don't necessarily operate like that, but that is what they are. They don't like it when you say that either. If we look at the way we operate, most of the metrics we use are lagging indicators. They tell us how we've done the last quarter, year, etc. But yet we really need to be concerned about the future. Now, this has always been true, but it is much more poignantly true today, and will continue to be more true in the future. And there are lots of data points. I won't go into them now. My colleagues will share some of them. There are lots of data points that underscore that change is happening faster today, that competition is harder, more egregious today. So when your mother or father says, "Why are you working so hard?" you can tell them that Professor Wolcott told you that competition is actually harder today than it was 20 years ago. So we have to try and figure this out. And rather than talking for too long, I'm going to share one story and then introduce my esteemed panelists to give their own perspective for a few minutes about where might the world be going in 10 years. And then after that, I'll ask them, how do they think about that question? Not what do you predict, but how do you think about the question of the future and apply it in your place of work and career, etc. And then after that, you have a job, and that is to ask questions. So we're going to spend as much time as we can with open questions to the floor. So the one story I'd bring up is I have a firm called Clareo Partners. We're a growth strategy firm, and one of our great long-term clients is Castrol. So Castrol is, by many counts, the leading lubricants company in the world. They make motor oil and other things like this, industrial applications, etc. And you would think for a lubricants company that where mobility is going would be important, and certainly it is. And there are a whole lot of things going on in this universe. How do we predict the future? Well, one of the issues that our direct client was dealing with her colleagues was, how do we get my colleagues at Castrol, and I can tell you this because they will share this, how do I get my colleagues at Castrol to recognize the importance of electric vehicles over the next 10 or 20 years? Now, she's not saying, I guarantee you electric vehicles are going to take over the global fleet. She's not saying that. We're not saying that. But we better have a play depending on where electric vehicles might go. We can't just sit back and wait for stuff to happen. Now, I don't know if you know this, but the reason why a company like Castrol or Mobil or others that sell lubricants need to be concerned is electric vehicles take no lubrication. Not just less, they take a little grease on the wheels. They literally take no lubrication. So you'd think people in that space would be freaking out, trying to figure out what to invest in. Well, for a long time, no. And they had great data to support why they weren't going to pay attention. And that was 120 years of proof that electric vehicles are the next big thing. Literally for 120 years, the electric vehicle was the next big thing in automotive, and it never happened. So now, if I'm in my office and I'm discussing, arguing with a colleague, and he says, we've got to pay attention to these electric vehicles, and I can say, well, look, it was supposed to happen in the turn of the last century. It was supposed to happen in the 1950s. It was supposed to happen with the GM rolled out, I think it was the EV1, and that was a dismal failure. So what's going to be different this time? Well, the point is not that we need to try and predict the future. The point is that we have to be prepared whatever the future might bring. And I won't go into the whole story as to how we shifted the management team. We did fundamentally shift their perspective. So they now have a portfolio of investments on the future, which is, and the essence of innovation strategy. The essence of innovation strategy is to build a portfolio of options on the future. All of you know a lot about portfolios, about that. This applies in innovation as well as it does in finance. So they've shifted their mind, but I'll give you one data point. So the electric two-wheeler in China is a dominant form of transportation. It's far surpassed motorcycles already in China. And about 5 years ago, coincidentally, 5 provinces of China all said, we will become the Detroit, interesting choice of word, but that's what they said, the Detroit of electric vehicles. And last year, there were, at last count was, best I could tell, was something like 70 different kinds of electric vehicles for sale in China. Now, neither you nor I would want to get in any of them because they're death traps. They're not very good for the most part, but what's going to happen? Some of them are going to get better and better and better, and eventually they're going to occur into the core markets and they're going to eat somebody else's lunch. So when they started seeing leading indicators like that, when they started seeing trends and forces, they realized that they had to not predict the future and put all their chips in one bet, on one bet, but that they had to have a variety of bets. So with that as a contextual story, I'd like to introduce my panelists. Jim Baird, the Chief Investment Officer from Plante Moran, Richard Day of Richard Day Research, and Tom Collinger of the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, a colleague at the great school up north. And I'm going to let them each speak for themselves, their perspective on where they see the world potentially going in the next 10 years. And then we'll, again, reconvene with the question, how do you think through where the world might go? With that, I turn the floor to Jim Baird.
Well, good afternoon, and let me say I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and talk about this topic, which is one that I find very interesting, and hopefully you will as well. Let me start by saying that by my very nature, I'm an optimistic person. You know, it's not glass half full, it's glass 3/4 full. And that's just sort of the way that I try to live my life. By some twist of fate, my interest in economics leads me to what many call the dismal science. Which is anything but optimistic, particularly in an age in which, as we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years, there are so many sources of risk and uncertainty, not only in the United States, but globally, that for the clients that we work with, in terms of assisting them with their investment portfolios, and I'm sure for many of you, making decisions in your businesses, there are any number of things to worry about and create some uncertainty. So at times, when I discuss what we see for the future, it might sound a little bearish. I don't think it is. I think there's a bright future in front of us, but it's not going to be without some bumps on the road. So as we sit here today, I think we're still in the middle of what is a slow growth economy. Not unusual for what is typically the case following periods of financial, but also very specifically credit crises, which is what we went through just a few years ago. Slow growth today, and I would argue likely slow growth into the future. It doesn't mean no growth, and also if we were to look out over the next 10 years, I don't think it means growth that was even as slow as what we might have seen from 2001 to 2010, where the economy grew at an annual average rate of about 1.6%. So probably better than that, but nonetheless, I think something that is going to look very different than the very long-term 3 to 3.5% average growth rate that the U.S. economy has seen for decades. So slow growth economy, why is that? I think without getting too deep into the details, there's a number of structural things that have changed. If you think about the period of 1982 to about 2007, there were some very significant tailwinds to the economy from a structural or even a secular basis. Falling interest rates from very high levels in the early 1980s to basically zero at the short end of the curve today. Disinflation, falling tax rates, deregulation. From a demographic perspective, the rise of the baby boomers into their peak consumption years. And today, I think we're in a very different set of circumstances. Does anybody honestly think tax rates are going to continue to go lower? Can interest rates, as a practical matter, go lower than they have today? Disinflation, yes, there's some concerns about deflation, but likely what we're facing in the years ahead will be a reversal of those long-term trends. And it has a very real impact, not only in terms of economic expectations, but also in terms of how we structure portfolios and manage money for our clients. So a very different environment as we move forward. I think there's another practical byproduct of that, and that would be for most of us, thinking back over that same time period, the 1980s, 90s, and the first half of this decade, we really went through an extended period that was almost a solid expansion here in the United States, with two very brief and relatively shallow recessions in the early 90s and then again in 2001. Obviously ended here just a couple of years ago. We think that, and I believe that's a little bit of an unusual circumstance or anomaly by historical standards as well. If you look back over the longer term, what does the typical business cycle in the United States look like? Shorter. Expansions from 1900 through about 2007, the most recent recession notwithstanding. Average expansion only lasted about 3.5 years. The average recession lasted a little over a year. So a shorter business cycle without those tailwinds, we think is something that is likely as well. Lower trend growth and more frequent contractions. Doesn't mean, and this is one of the things that we have to drive home to our clients, doesn't mean that it's going to look like the recession of 2007 and 2009 again. Again, I'd say that was an anomaly. But in terms of making investment decisions or business decisions, I think we need to be prepared for that possibility. The one crisis that I see on the horizon is not likely to come as a surprise to anybody in this room. This is really the fiscal crisis and the deficit spending that we're seeing at the federal governmental level, which clearly is unsustainable and clearly is going to need to be dealt with, and clearly is something that neither party in Washington is really, really eager to seriously consider. It's going to require additional revenues likely, it's going to require even greater spending cuts to deal with, and most importantly, I think it's going to require a significant discussion about the longstanding social contract as it relates to things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and some of the overwhelming costs that are projected to be associated with those programs in the decades ahead. So from a business perspective, what do we do with this? I certainly wouldn't suggest that it's all doom and gloom. I don't think that's the case at all. But I think what we're looking at is the need for creativity, innovation, flexibility, lifelong learning. Many of the things that those of you in this room have been doing for some period of time anyway to achieve that success.
Thanks, Jim. Before I turn it over to Richard, you mentioned something really important, a number of things that were very important here. But one was I'm an optimist, and the reason I point that out is I think everybody in the room needs to reflect on what are you at heart? Are you an optimist or a pessimist? And I learned from a mentor of mine in my 20s the management methodology, very serious, Tiggers and Eeyores. So, if you have kids, you know who they are. Tigger is the optimist, oh my God, it's raining outside, isn't that great? And Eeyore is the, we're never going to make it, we're all doomed, right? So, and this is quite serious. People are more one or the other, and there's research that suggests this. So as you're thinking about the future, first of all, know which one you are more of. And second, make sure you have a mix of these people in your teams that are making decisions. Because if everybody in your team is generally a Tigger, you'll all jump off a cliff together. And if everybody's an Eeyore, nothing will ever happen. So we need both to be effective. With that, I'll turn the floor to Richard Day.
My perspective on this is completely different than Jim's. I'm coming at this being a political person for the last 35 years and doing the exit polling and election night analysis for ABC. And what I would like to talk to you about is just how a political event, this last campaign, this last election took place, the things that were so anomalous, and some of the lessons to take from it that apply both to politics and to business. No president had ever been reelected with an unemployment above 7.2%, which was the case when we went into this last election. Consumer confidence was never lower for somebody to be reelected. The right direction, wrong track, which is a standard question to ask, was never less favorable to an incumbent. The enthusiasm for Barack Obama in 2012 looked very much, in terms of measurement, like the enthusiasm for John McCain in 2008. So it was flipped, right? More enthusiasm for Romney and flipped for Obama. With an unlimited campaign funding deal, one would think that that too spelled a very different kind of outcome than it was. And of course you know that it was a very, very close election. And I'd like to just talk about a couple of things that make this so, I guess, fascinating. Mitt Romney wins. Mitt Romney wins. Some of you may know who that was. Mitt Romney won white voters by 20 points over Barack Obama. In 2012, white voters comprised 72% of the electorate. In 2004, they comprised 77% of the electorate. Do you see a hint here? Romney won independent voters by 5 points, and that was an unprecedented margin. And the Romney campaign had focused intensely on the independent vote and winning the independent vote, and ultimately won it nationwide. He won males by 7 points, married people by 14 points, voters over age 60 by 9 points, white voters, I did say white voters by 20 points. How does somebody like, with that sort of a stack, lose an election? Becomes the fun part, or the interesting part, depending on what side of the fence you sit. Obama wins African Americans by 87 points, and in 2012 they accounted for 13% of the electorate. And here comes one of those things that just hit like a stone. Obama won Hispanic voters by 44 points, and in 2012 they accounted for 10% of the electorate. I'm going to show you a chart. I'm not going to show it to you. I'm going to tell you about it, but you can see it later. A chart that shows the Hispanic population in the United States increased by a factor of 4 from 1970. So from 1970 to 2010, they now account for about 16.5% of the electorate, whereas in 1970 they were about 4.5% of the electorate. And Obama wins females. Now the female vote, fascinating in that it always is larger than the male vote. It's about 52-48 female to male, and females went very much for Obama. And the chart about the growth of the Hispanic vote and how that all worked. There are so many ironies that are happening, as Rob would say, faster and faster in the political arena. I think some of you may remember Lee Atwater, who was a Republican operative who did a lot to make the South even stronger Republican. And by the 2010, every Democratic member of Congress who represented a rural area had lost. So it was completely moved over. They began the defense, the Republican Party began the Defense of Marriage Act in 2004. It had tremendous ways to bring people out who had never come out before. There's a wonderful professor, Elizabeth Muller-Neumann, who talked about the spiral of silence theory, in which people who believe that they have a minority opinion are much less likely to articulate it than those who believe they have a majority opinion. And what had happened was, with these initiatives and ballot initiatives like the Defense of Marriage Act, brought out a whole group of people who typically had not voted before. In political parlance, it's like a whole new group of money coming to the table, right? So in that context, in 2010, President Scott Walker of Wisconsin wins with an avowed agenda to kind of take down the public employee unions, to move to a much more conservative spending agenda and a socially very conservative agenda. He withstands, I guess he got elected, what, in 2006 and 2010. There was the recall election that failed miserably, or succeeded for him remarkably. And then in 2012, you had the most popular former governor of Wisconsin running for the Senate seat, of her poll, Tommy Thompson, against an openly gay female member of Congress from Wisconsin. And in 2012, Barack Obama wins Wisconsin, and Tammy Baldwin defeats Tommy Thompson. Enough said. I mean, we talked about drawing the line and making the prediction. I mean, that is truly disruptive, I would argue. Lots of reasons why the Obama campaign won. Largely, I think, largely it was about the Hispanic vote, the female vote, and much more to those cases, the ability to organize. They never left Ohio after the 2008 election. And the Romney people thought they were crazy to have all these offices all over the state. But what they found was that the Obama campaign had built relationships for all of those 4 years that were individually based. And they organized house to house, house by house, 10,000 interviews in a state to find out what people were thinking, to test messages, to call those 10,000 people back, to find out how those messages resonated, and test it again. Every piece of online work was tested multiple times before it went out to make sure that it was as effective as it could be. They even found Obama voters in very strong Romney precincts. It was the reason why the Obama campaign did not leave Florida. Because from one perspective, Obama didn't have a chance in Florida, but by knowing it house to house and voter to voter, they were able to find those pieces and stack them up together, and ultimately Obama won. I would say that the points to take away from something like this really is one of those truths from that great philosopher, Huey Long, the governor. Now, he said the truest thing I know about politics, and I'm sure it's bigger than politics. It's your enemies who elect you, and it's your friends who defeat you. Now think back on how that might play out, right? To get through a Republican presidential primary, Mitt Romney had to describe himself as a severe conservative. Mitt Romney had to take positions against opening up immigration, even the DREAM Act, any of it. He had to shut it down completely, otherwise he doesn't get out of this primary. A lot of people who don't understand the political process will say, well, they're so phony. They say one thing and then they say another thing. Well, to get out of a primary, you've got to run to the edges of your party's support group, and then to get into the win a general, you've got to run back to the middle. So there is a bit of running this way, running that way. But then think about Herman Cain, Michelle Bachmann, Newt Gingrich, Rick Perry, Ron Paul, all banging on this guy, all forcing him further and further out to get through these primaries. And then, once you've taken those positions to get through the primary, then you've got to scramble back to the middle. And it became less believable the further out he had to go to get through those primaries. In August, Romney was out of funds, believe it or not, at that time. And then the Obama campaign had full sway to own the media and define Romney. That has been described to me by a friend who's an extraordinary political operative as campaign malfeasance. To have left yourself with an empty treasury in a month when you couldn't get back on those airways, it just never works. You also had no help from people like Todd Akin in Missouri, or Richard Murdoch in Indiana. Remember, Richard Murdoch knocked off Richard Lugar, one of the great giants of the Senate, one of the great, he's a giant, beaten by a guy named Murdoch, who described compromise as when they agree with us. And that's a pretty hard thing to swallow, even in a state as Republican as Indiana, I would argue. I think the points to take away from all this is that it's an enormously tightly divided electorate. I don't think anybody could misunderstand that. You know, the House is likely to not change for at least the next 10 or 12 years, because the state legislatures 19 of which are Republican controlled, draw the map, right? And whoever draws the map draws the winners, as you can see in Illinois. And so as long as the House is going to be solidly Republican, and these districts are drawn not to be as competitive as possible, but to be as non-competitive as possible. So it's easier to be kind of on the outside edges of your party rather than a centrist to win these kinds of seats. The Senate quite evenly divided, and had the Republicans not given away Missouri and Indiana, among others, it would have been closer. So what you've got is a very, very evenly divided electorate. I would argue that one of the most important takeaways, especially for the business side, is to put your bets on one side is foolish. You've got to hedge your bets because there is no way that one side is going to dominate this kind of an electorate or this kind of a policy positioning. So for however one might vote personally, any of those associations that represent you must need to have good friends on both sides.
Thanks, Richard. We have some bipartisan support here. Tom, so Richard discussed demographics early on, and you said something very interesting when we were having our spin-up conversation in the ante room. And that was demographics are powerful, but they're worthless in isolation. You have to combine them with other things like, for instance, behavior, which I thought was very interesting.
So I was asked to summarize in 5 minutes the impact of all things digital. Should be easy. And so the lens through which I am going to do this is by looking at behavior. And I want to share about 6 seemingly independent data points about some things that have happened in terms of changes in consumer behavior, and then roll up to extrapolating from those 6, what does this mean to businesses in the future. So first is in 2012, 36% of television viewing was neither live nor on television. Over 40% of tablet and smartphone owners use them to watch television, 40%. So you now have things like social television, multi-screening, interactive television engagement programming. Online e-tailing grew 30% during Black Friday and Cyber Monday, while brick and mortar was slightly down. 30%, slightly down. Over 50% of e-commerce this season was via mobile usage. So now you have a new behavior called showrooming. Showrooming being you go into the store, you see what you like, and you go and buy it online. You have manufacturers becoming retailers because everybody's open 24 hours. From July 11th to July 12th, Pinterest generated over 40 million unique users. I'm not going to embarrass you by asking if you know what Pinterest is, but ask your children. Pinterest is a huge growth area in a new thing called social commerce, where companies are basically sharing with their customers the things they're thinking about making and letting the customers tell them what they ought to be making. Social commerce. The average Facebook user spends more than 8 hours a day on it. Women spend 9. 8 hours a day. Yep. Yeah. 47% of social media users use social for communicating about or accessing customer care. So you don't call customer service anymore. You social comment on it, and you get responded to. IBM has over 12,000 blogs. Employees at IBM who are thought leaders, sharing what it is that is important to their small group of constituents, 12,000 blogs. Content marketing now averages 12% of marketing communications budgets. That means companies are trying to share what they think about the category to be thought of as thought leaders. In December, 182 million U.S. internet users watched 38 billion online content videos in a month. And the last is something that's close to my heart. The majority of faculty in universities in the U.S. believe that distance learning and or blended learning will be the norm in 5 years. Now, these are all somewhat independent. Let me summarize what I think it means. Number one is the velocity of change is somewhat staggering. The rate at which people are changing, not the fact that there's new technologies, there have always been new technologies, but the rate in which people are changing their fundamental behaviors is faster. So it raises questions, business questions like, are you investing in enough new experiments to be of service to your customers that they may want? Are you genuinely listening to what they're saying about you in all the media that they're sharing because they're sharing it? If you don't know it, you need to know it. Do you have strategies to engage and communicate with them when you do share? Do you measure the impact of those engagements, both online and offline? Are you adding relevant engagement strategies that include thought leadership? Are you using real-time data, not just lab data, to figure out what's going on? Are you feeling handicapped because you're a big company rather than enabled and well capitalized because you're a big company? So the first one has to do with the velocity of change is greater than predicted. The second one is something I call my brand, my way, which is basically what people think now is their relationship to what they buy. They want what they want, and they want it the way they want it. So the best example happened to my wife and I. It was a holiday season. We took a long distance car trip, and we managed to, with a car that could access 30,000 songs on my iPod, satellite radio, all the local radio stations, and anything that could be streamed from my phone. Anything could be streamed from my phone. We went searching for WBEZ because that's our station. So there we were in the middle of Texas listening to our station. My brand, my way. That's the way people increasingly are going to.
But there's so much great country content there in Central Texas. Sorry.
When was the last time you drove through it? Anyway.
Oh, okay, sorry, that was rude of me. I appreciate that. So, Tom, before we go back to the question of how, so you all gave a little bit of a glimpse of the future. I want to push that more. And the question we're going to go in a second is, how do you think about the future? So that people can maybe apply that in their own context. But I want to ask for an example. You mentioned it in our setup and also now, which is, rather than looking at lagging data, what is the give us an example of real-time data and its impact on a business.
So I'll use the social commerce idea, which may seem like not such a big deal, but it's a rapidly growing, like hockey stick chart growth. So think about a company that goes to the people that have been prospects and buyers and says, well, we're thinking about creating this product or this piece of clothing, but we're also thinking about this one and this one and this one. We're going to make the one that you all vote on most. Now think about the level of participation, engagement. Forget about pricing strategies, right? Not important, because this is my company who's giving me what I want. I have a stake in actually co-creating that very thing. You can't do that unless you are real-time, engaging, listening, hearing, capturing, and then using that data to drive your strategies.
Great. So let's, and remember, you're on the hook next, so be ready. But all of you are welcome to answer, or one or two of you, it's up to you. How do you go about thinking about the future in your particular space?
It all gets more intensely personal, just as he said. But I think there are some real issues that are going to come up, and I don't know how they're ever going to be addressed. But the whole issue of privacy. Privacy is probably gone, and we want to hold on to the idea that it exists. But I can tell you that even in this last campaign, they had something like 88 variables on every person they contacted out of those 10,000 calls in every one of those swing states and multiple calls back. And those data come from everywhere. the scraping of websites, and this is not unique to campaigns. These probably follow on to a lot of corporate work. But think about all of these issues of privacy, because, for example, in Germany, some of these things could never be done. We do a fair amount of work globally, and as you go nation to nation, you're finding very different rules. But think about privacy and how all of this gets impacted, and how much you want somebody to know about you, and how much you think is known about you, and how all that plays. I think that's kind of the creep out part of it.
I'll jump in quickly and not surprisingly say that, like the basketball coach who tells you, don't look at their head, watch their feet. That's what I would suggest, is that, what can you do to anticipate all this? Watch behavior. Don't look at the new technologies. Look at how they're responding to them. The Apple Newton was invented in 1992 and nobody bought it. So look at how they're changing, and my comment earlier about demographics. Demographics can be your friend, but not in the aggregate. Look at the demographics of the markets that are important to you and see how that group is changing behavior. See how that group is fundamentally doing things differently. And don't just look at it in the category of your business. Well, this is how they, let's say forget about the example. Regardless of the business they're in, they are people first. The first time anybody of you ever bought something on Amazon with one-click ordering, did you ever say, well, okay, just Amazon, I don't expect that from other people anymore? Well, of course you do. When your experience in how you do things is fundamentally improved, the expectation bar increases across the board. So study what your demographic, your audience is doing, look at their behavioral changes, and introduce some simple, easy experiments to see if, because of these new behaviors, they are open to new decisions.
But Tom, I want to add something you alluded to, which is if you only look at your current customers as you define them and look for their behaviors, you might be behind. You probably will be behind, because there'll be fringe groups that look like fringe today, or non-customers or emerging. Look at them and see what they're doing as well, and then try and translate that back to, that might be a leading indicator for some of your core customers. Jim, thoughts about how you think about the future? Not what do you predict, but how do you think about it?
Sure. And it's interesting, as you pose the question, I am immediately taken to the process that we go through in terms of structuring investment portfolio. Because in a sense, that's what we're trying to do. Number one, if there's anything positive that came out of the financial crisis, I would say it's don't rule anything out. Don't assume, well, that can't happen. Because it might. And in the case of that, it did. It's the failure of the imagination. So even if it's a low probability event, at least take it into consideration. What happens if that low probability event occurs? How are you going to react to that? Are you prepared for that potentially? So that would be the first thing. Secondly, I would say cast a very broad net in terms of gathering data or opinions. And again, I think in the aftermath of that experience for investors, it has opened up the door or given a platform to doomsayers who have always been there. But now, people give them just a little bit more credence. Well, what if the dollar collapses? What if, the Eurozone collapses? What are we going to do? So people are more open to that. But I would say, cast a broad net, listen to people who don't necessarily agree with your view of the world. And so, from my perspective, it's paying attention to what those people have to say. Even frankly, if I disagree with it, I don't think it's likely, because you can still learn something. Likewise, I get very frustrated when I listen to some of the Pollyannas that say, well, look long term, it's all going to be fine, don't worry. I think that's not the wisest way to approach the process either. So incorporate those views in. I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make is only listening to people that agree with you and reinforce the same views that you have. You could be right. You could be absolutely right, but you could be very wrong, and the risk and the cost of being wrong could be tremendous.
I was going to say that's related to what we call the confirmation bias, which is particularly important in the innovation space. But I want to push on something and ask you to talk a little bit more about don't rule things out. I mean, it makes sense that, I get that, don't rule out those black swans or whatever might happen. But we have to make decisions and put in place bets. We can't actually place a bet on everything. So how do you rectify these two facts?
So, good question. So the way that I think about that is, look, if we knew today what was going to be the best performing area of the capital markets over the next 5 years, you put all your chips in that corner. You know, if we knew it was emerging market equities, that's where you want to be. If you knew that we were headed into a global crisis, then it's probably cash and gold, or bullets, or however you want to approach it, I suppose. But we don't know. You know, and so you go through that process, and you have to assign some probabilities. You're not going to get it right, but you have to. Somebody used the term earlier: hedge your bets a little bit, and you know, you're going to, in the process, reduce your downside risk. You're also going to reduce, you know, the potential upside, but that's sort of the trade-off that you have to go through. And as you go through that process, you know, as we go through the process, it's the constant process of analyzing data, looking at policy, potential policy changes that are coming down the line, you know, debating these things, deliberating, arguing, poking holes in theories to try to arrive at a point where maybe you're right or maybe you're wrong, but at least you've got a strategy that's well thought out, and you haven't painted yourself into a corner for only one potential eventuality. And then the last point that I would make there is you make your decision, whatever that is, but that's not the end of it. You continue to monitor circumstances. You continue to adjust your course. You continue to evaluate, has your core thesis changed, and change with it if you have to. Don't be afraid to admit you're wrong or make some tweaks along the way.
Yeah, I don't see enough investors, business people, et cetera, identifying the leading indicators. They might do that, but then they don't track them. And then, you know, they say, well, we'll deal with that the next time we go through our rebalance, which of course doesn't make any sense. So how do you gain the discipline of tracking those leading indicators and then knowing when to make fundamental changes or just change around the edges? It's really good advice. Easier said than done, of course. So questions from the room? Anybody? Wow, that must have been a good dessert. Yeah, Craig.
I'll start you off. You talked about velocity of change. You talked about these dramatic changes in demographic assessors. Where's your Richter scale? Where's that flag? How do you set that flag or identify when the velocity has changed so much that you have to put the stop order in, that you got to get out of the project, move to a different portfolio of options?
Right. So I love that question. So if you shift the historic orientation of we spend all this time planning for a 3 to 5 to 10 year strategic plan, and then we work the plan, and then we adjust annually. If you shift from that mentality to being in constant real-time understanding of what people's behavioral changes are, how they're responding, then you have the ability to not look at it as a binary decision, flip it on or flip it off, but small wins, small experiments, small adjustments, small samples. And so you evolve your way forward rather than place larger bets, small bets.
So the one thing I would add to that is, to put it in investment terms, don't risk more than you can afford to lose. You know, because the situation does evolve, and you know, as conditions change, as the fundamental change, data change, whatever it is you're looking at, you know, you may be even more convinced, even though it's working against you in the short term. You may have that conviction around the idea and can forge ahead, but if you're risking more than you can afford to lose and you're wrong, that could be, you know, the end of the game.
You know, of course, in the political world, if your market share is 49.9%, you're a loser. And if it's 50% plus one, you're a genius. And I think it's probably important to always keep in mind that no matter how you place your bets, you have to be sure that you're listening to the right market or the right part of the market or the right segment of the market. Otherwise, I would think you could get driven off a cliff very easily. And I think that depends so much on what it is that you are doing or selling or being, rather than listen to the market. You can listen to a leading edge of the market as you define it, as opposed to the middle and the laggards, but always understand that it's a leading edge and that you're still going to have to fund your company or fund your sales with those people who are in the middle and who have not gotten there yet. You want to be ready for the bigger shift when the bigger shift happens by listening to the smaller segment. politically that becomes a lot tougher because everybody's trying to yank you from one end to the other. But I expect that's the way it is in the marketplace as well.
So I want to follow that for a second. So whether it's in politics or investments, understanding what consumers want, or customers for that matter, how do you figure out who the leading edge people are? Well, who are those small segments? By definition, you're not generally focused on them, so you need to go out, you can't look at everybody. So how do you become strategic about selecting those small vanguard segments that you really need to be paying attention to?
The motto at our company is very profound. You might want to write this down. Nothing predicts behavior like behavior. So if you are looking at certain kinds of behaviors and you can understand what your basic market is about, you are looking for those people who are off on those edges, right? And if you can monitor those people in a little bit more real time, that can be particularly useful. But everybody's got to feed the bigger part of your market before it catches up to the more advanced part or the more leading edge part. And I think that becomes an extraordinarily difficult task because it's not all about consumer products and it's not all about anything. It's about what your business is and how you manage your business in that time of change. But still, you're going to have this greater lump of your business, whether they're your voters or your buyers of whatever, who are going to be moving slower. You just want to be ready.
I also think there are two segments that are enormously valuable. I would watch their feet. The first is the ones who absolutely are your very, very, very best customers, whether they're clients or customers or consumers. They have already voted by saying you've done it right, so figure out what it is that you've done right and better understand what it is that they have needs for that they actually could fill with what it is that you haven't invented yet. So get really, really close to them, understand how they live, what their needs are. You're in their house. The second group is the ones that don't like it, the ones that have said, thank you, no, not anymore. They're telling you something. Figure out what it is that they're telling you and figure out why it is that they disappeared. It may be for the right reasons and you don't want them back, but it may very well be that they're the leading market.
And that takes a lot of guts and self-knowledge, not just to reach out to them, but also to listen effectively to them. So we have time for one more question. Yes?
This is for Mr. Garrett. I hear what you're saying about slower growth and more frequent contractions. I have a hard time accepting it.
You're not allowed to disagree with the panelists.
Yes, Mr. Only the moderator.
Can I take you home to have a discussion with my wife?
Well, unfortunately, I do agree, because that's what I see, is that this is what we're experiencing, is slower growth. But if the logical conclusion to that is that, we're just never going to employ people, and we're mass producing college graduates and we'll have no place to go, and we've got, 50-something guys and gals that are going to be, put out the pasture with no place to go. Are you saying that we'll never see a 4, 5, or 6% GDP? I'd be interested in diving a little deeper on that.
No. No, not that we'll never see it. And what I would say, and this is I'm glad you brought this up. A couple critical thoughts. Number one, it's not no growth, it's slower growth. So I still think we're going to see continued expansion of the economy, at a pace, as I said earlier, that's likely to exceed what we've experienced over the last 10 years. Because I don't think, if sounder heads prevail from a policy perspective, that we're going to need to go through another crisis like we did. However, I'm sorry? Big if. No, I completely agree. My cynical side completely agrees with you. But having said that, I think what we're looking at is an extended period of time where it's going to take some time to unwind, in particular, the excessive leverage that's built up. Not so much in the corporate sector. Corporate balance sheets, for the most part, are much cleaner. But it's the consumer sector where we saw, again, over that time period I referenced earlier, this huge buildup of debt that's going to take some time to work down. Consumers simply don't have the ability to spend, in many cases, the way that they did in the period leading up to 2007. But the good news is we're seeing that correct. You're seeing leverage and indebtedness at the household level come down. Much of that arguably is shifted to the government sector. That's really, I think, where the next focus is going to be. In time, we're going to go through this. Look, at the end of the day, there's risk, but there's always been risk. There's always been sources of uncertainty. There's always been something to worry about. I think the key is in figuring out how do you navigate that and put yourself in the best position when we come out the other side, whenever that is, to be well positioned.
Great, so I'm sure you'll all agree that we could talk about these things for the next few hours. This has been great. But we're going to have to conclude. I have a few thoughts and observations from the panel. Richard, in your spin-up, you alluded to the fact that the future is not an extrapolation from the present necessarily. But I don't know about you, I've had many situations where I'm working with students or clients or whatever, and they want to try and figure out where the world's going, understandably, to have that privileged knowledge, to be able to place the right bets, as you mentioned, Jim. And then so we'll go through these processes to identify scenarios and various factors. What are the leading indicators? We go through this rigorous process. We come up with various scenarios, very exciting. And then the natural question someone asks is, okay, which one of these is most likely? And I want to put all my bets in that one. And I realize that that person has just completely missed the entire point of the exercise. And I say, look, if that's your approach, then don't waste your time on this stuff. Just take the present and extrapolate it out to the future, because that's the one that seems the most likely. You know, like Lehman Brothers failing. That was clearly the most likely outcome 5 or 6 years ago. So this stuff is tough, but if it were easy, everybody'd do it and there'd be no money in it. I love the fact we had some simpatico here. Richard, you mentioned behavior is the best indicator or predictor of behavior. And that's one of the things that Tom has spent his career looking at, watching and understanding behavior. And part of that, one thing I want to build on, put two things together that Tom does a lot, I understand, and that is that he mentioned co-creation. One of the great ways to understand, not just observe or talk about, but understand others' behaviors is actually to co-create things with them, because you get direct experiences with them, and that's a skill that can be honed. I also love that you said many small experiments. You said evolve your way. And that's always been true, but in faster change environments, remember, Charles Darwin was not talking about the best organism always wins in the long run forever. He was saying the most adaptable organisms are the ones that win as things change. And so we evolve our way, though, more quickly. And the future is an emergent phenomenon. So how do we understand how to discover those emergent phenomenons, observing behavior, co-creating, etc. And then, Jim, I learned to go not only buy gold, but also bullets. So I'm going to go home and talk to my wife about that. I think my uncle already recommended it from his bunker in Colorado, but who knows? So never rule anything out, but the trick is knowing when to rule things down so that you can actually make bets that provide the portfolio. And you mentioned the shorter business cycle. I'm hearing that from a lot of places, very well thought out perspective, and I tend to agree it probably would be that. But one thing we didn't have time to get into this afternoon is a very short panel. We happen to be here in America. Admittedly, we didn't get into global issues much. It would have been tough to do in 50 minutes. But a lot of the world is happening outside America. As much as I'm an American, I've been here for a really long time. And I deeply love this place. But a lot of these trends, behaviors, forces that we alluded to are actually happening more outside the country. We're going to have to be more mindful of that. And one little wrinkle I put to the room about the shorter business cycle is it's happening within a massive super cycle of development worldwide. It's patchy, obviously. There are some places moving faster than others. It's going to be volatile. But nonetheless, the next 10 to 20 years is seeing the greatest rise in the number of people from nothing, in many cases, to eventually middle class. And that is driving opportunity. And I'll end with my colleague from the audience, Jim, who very bravely disagreed with our panelists. He said, I'm not willing to just agree with that. Now, I agree with you, is what he said. But is that good enough? Is that what we should be thinking about? Our jobs are to help our clients figure out how to overcome 1.6% growth. Our job is to figure out how to have a country, and in the context of global history, we have one of the best environments ever created to create prosperity, the pursuit of happiness, and all these things. And in this world of massive growth and change, it is our job and responsibility to figure out how to make that happen more and better in the future, to protect our ability to find the pursuit of happiness we all require. Thanks a lot to the panelists and to all of you.
Okay, thank you. How about you guys?
Very good.
Otherwise, why is the